Hey everyone, today I'm going to show you how to make a steampunk gun prop thing out of a couple exercise mats and a bunch of tubing and some other stuff. And I just want to mention, for safety's sake, even though you know this is a prop and it's made out of foam and it can't do anything, other people might not know that, and from a long way away it might look dangerous. So be careful where you take it. Now let's make our steampunk prop gun. Start by printing out your pattern, making sure it's being printed at actual size, or 100%, which are the same thing. Now tape together the two pages that make up the stock, being sure to line up the alignment crosses. Then you can cut out all the pattern pieces. I like to use scissors most of the time, but for the tricky bits, I pull out my scalpel. And as I hope you already know, sharp knives are sharp, so always look at what's ahead of the blade and don't cut your fingers off. Now, you can see how excited I am at the thought of cutting out this fancy pants swirly piece, so I'm going to show you a handy trick. You'll need your pattern piece printed on an inkjet printer, a sponge, and a festive hat bowl. Fill the hat bowl with water, put your pattern piece face down on the foam sheet, and slowly sponge down the paper, being careful not to move it at all. Once it's thoroughly saturated, you can carefully lift up your soggy piece of paper to reveal the design. Just remember, the result will be a mirror image of the original, but for our purposes today, it doesn't really matter. Of course, if you don't have an inkjet printer or a festive hat bowl, it will still work fine with a knife and a bunch of time. Once your pattern pieces are cut out, you can trace them onto your foam. It's helpful to mark the center lines and the centers of all the holes. Also, some pattern pieces are cut out more than once, often flipped for the second one. To transfer the swirly lines on pieces 10 and 26, you can either use the wet sponge method, or by tracing on top of the pattern with a ballpoint pen, using enough pressure to kind of rip through the paper, which leaves some marks on the foam that you can trace. Next, draw over those lines with a fair bit of pressure, creating some nice deep indentations in the foam. I'm using two different thicknesses of EVA foam in this project. The 2mm, which you've already seen, and some 12mm foam. This is the type of foam that you can get as interlocking mats to put on the floor and set your weights on. Grab a mat and trace piece number 1 4 times, making sure to flip the paper over to create two mirror image sets. For one set, trace the oval cutout, but for the second set, once you have the outline traced, cut along the dotted lines on the pattern and trace those lines on as well. Once all your pieces are traced, it's time to start cutting. Always use a very sharp knife for cutting, otherwise your foam will end up with really rough edges. You may notice I like to use a wide blade for straight and larger radius cuts, and my scalpel for sharp corners and small radius curves. And don't forget to punch any holes that are required as well. The textured side of the exercise mat is kind of shiny and glue doesn't stick to it very well, which is why it's a good idea to sand all 4 stock pieces and the 4 circle pieces with some coarse sandpaper. Now it's time to glue the layers together. I would often use hot glue for this, but today I'm going to use water-based contact cement. Apply contact cement to the textured side of both stock pieces with the slot cut in them. Always follow the safety directions on the bottle of whatever glue you're using. I'm not sure why, but I forgot to put on gloves when I was doing this. I guess I was just really excited to start gluing something. You can also apply glue to all 4 of your large circle pieces. Once the glue has dried according to the instructions, carefully line up the 2 stock pieces and slowly press them together, working your way from the back of the stock to the front. You can see how I'm using my fingers to separate the 2 halves so they don't stick together until they're in the right place. Once it's lined up, give it all a good squish down, and go ahead and stick the discs together. Now you can glue one of your outside stock pieces to your stack of center stock pieces. Cut a piece of 1/2-inch PVC conduit 92 centimeters long. This will be the lower barrel of the gun, but will also act as a support for the stock. I like to use a tubing cutter for nice straight cuts. Mark approximately where the tube leaves the stock, and sand the section of the tube that's going to be in the stock. This will help our glue stick way better. When you heat PVC, it releases toxic fumes, so take it outside and wear a respirator. And some gloves so you don't burn your hands. I'm going to try out my new heat gun today that looks a bit like a spaceship. A big thanks to Wagner who sent it to me so I could try it out. I set it to 650 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 340 Celsius. Heat up the section where it needs to curve nice and slowly until it becomes flexible. Pop it in the slot and let it cool. Next, make marks on the pipe at each end of the oval hole in the stock, and drill a hole about 5 mm behind that mark so it's hidden by the side when it goes back on. Take 2.5 meters of old telephone wire, stick it in the hole, and start wrapping towards the other line. Go a couple wraps past the second line, drill another hole, and stick the end into it. You can really use any kind of wire you have around, you just might need more or less of it. You'll also want to cut away a little bit more foam right where the wire coil is going to sit. Again, the width of that cut will depend on how thick the wire is that you end up using. Next, I'm going to cover the part of the barrel that sticks out with copper tape to make it look coppery. I find metallic tapes to be extremely uncooperative when you're trying to get them on smooth with no wrinkles. So I like to tape both ends of the strip down onto the table, stretching it as tight as possible. Then I can center the PVC tube on the copper tape, cut or pull off the clear tape that's holding it down, and then you can start rubbing the tape down, working from the center line out to the edges. The main thing you're trying to avoid is trapping air bubbles underneath the tape, so work slowly and methodically and you should end up with a pretty good finish. You can see that I've covered the bottom of the pipe first, because hopefully when we put the top two barrels on, they'll hide the seam where the next piece of copper tape starts. The next piece just needs to be wide enough to cover the remaining tube, so cut a strip that's just a little bit wider than the gap. For these thinner strips, peel a portion of the backing paper away, line up one edge with the edge of the tape already on the tube, and stick that edge down as you go along. Once that entire edge is stuck in place, you can burnish the tape down, working towards the other edge. You can also burnish the tape over the end of the barrel. Apply a generous portion of hot glue in the bottom and sides of the slot, and press the lower barrel in place. For good measure, add a little more on top. Now you can finally get out your contact cement again and glue the last piece onto your stock stack. Now that's a pretty square looking stock, so it's time to start giving it some contours. I really like using an old electric carving knife I got from the thrift store. It seems to me to be the easiest way to get kinda smooth cuts when carving EVA foam. However, if you don't happen to have an electric carving knife, you can still do a fantastic job using a very sharp utility knife. I did one side of the stock with the electric carving knife and the other side with the utility knife, just to show that you can get a good result either way. Once you've got the contours you like, sweep the foam bits into your festive hat bowl and use them to help plump up your beanbag chair. You're welcome, environment. Now grab some 80 grit sandpaper, wrap it around something round, and use it to smooth out all your crazy cutting. Once you're done sanding, it's still gonna look kinda fuzzy. You can get rid of a lot of that by taking it outside and giving it a blast with your spaceship heat gun. Again, wear a respirator and do it outside because foam can also release toxic fumes when heated. It's a bit hard to see on the video, but it actually made a really big difference using the heat gun. Now let's add 2 more barrels on top of the first. Set them in place on the stock and mark and cut them equal with the lower barrel. Cover them both with copper tape, the same way you did the first one. If you want a brushed texture, grab an abrasive scrubbing pad and spin the pipe while holding the pad around it. Now you can tack the top barrels together in a couple places with a bit of hot glue, and then mix up some 5-minute 2-part epoxy. Hot glue doesn't stick that well to the copper tape, and we don't want the barrel to fall apart randomly in the middle of a very important shootout. It's important that you measure and mix your epoxy according to the instructions and that you mix it very thoroughly. Otherwise, it's possible that it just won't cure and you'll have a really gooey, disgusting mess. Once your epoxy is mixed, you can apply it in the center crack between the 2 barrels. We don't want it to run through the crack because we're trying to keep the glue all on the inside, so that when you're finished, it doesn't look like your gun's been glued together by someone in their basement. Once that glue is cured, glue the 2 barrels on top of the stock. You can slide the 2 circle pieces over the 3 barrels to hold it all in place until the glue cures. Jam a little bit of glue in between the barrels at the front and you should be good. Alright, so that's the basic rifle structure done. Now it's time to add a whole bunch of super sweet details to make it super sweet. Okay, that's it for part 1 of steampunk gun making. Make sure you watch the video right here for part 2 where I put it all together and paint it. And also at the end of that video, I'm going to show you a sneak preview of my next project that I've already started that's going to be crazy cool and amazing. It'll blow your mind. So, see you in the next video.